My name is Diana, and I am 30 years old. I laid in a sterile hospital bed, my body throbbing from a surgery to remove my kidney for the mother of my husband. My husband stood over me, but instead of holding my hand, he dropped a stack of divorce papers on my chest. His mistress stepped into the room, flashing a diamond engagement ring. They thought they had outsmarted me, discarding me the second they got what they wanted. But they forgot one crucial detail about what I do for a living. By the time the surgeon walked into the room, their luxurious victory trip was about to turn into a massive federal nightmare. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who severely underestimated your worth. The fluorescent lights of the Chicago hospital recovery room burned my eyes as I slowly blinked awake. A deep, searing pain radiated from my side, a harsh reminder of the organ I had given up. I expected my husband of 4 years, Bradley, to be waiting with a relieved smile. Instead, the first thing I heard was the sharp, impatient tapping of his designer leather shoes against the linoleum floor. Bradley did not ask how I was feeling, or if the pain was manageable. He simply tossed a thick manila folder onto my lap, the heavy paper landing squarely on my fresh surgical bandages. I winced, clutching my side. "Sign the waiver of contest," Diana Bradley said, his voice completely devoid of any warmth. "Mom got the kidney, our deal is done. Cassidy has reservations for us in Maui tonight, and I need this finalized before our flight." I stared at him through the lingering haze of anesthesia, trying to process the absolute cruelty of his words. Before I could speak, the door creaked open wider. Cassidy, the young escrow officer from the commercial real estate firm where Bradley worked, strolled into my private recovery suite. She wore a pristine white sundress ready for vacation and carried a designer iced coffee. Without a hint of shame, she stepped up to Bradley and wrapped her arm around his waist. She deliberately raised her left hand, twisting a massive diamond ring into the harsh hospital lighting. "Thank you so much for the kidney," Diana Cassidy said, her lips curling into a triumphant smirk as she looked down at my bandaged body. "Since you were stuck in the operating room all morning, Bradley and I finally had time to go ring shopping without any distractions. It really worked out perfectly for everyone." Before I could react to the sheer audacity of her statement, a commotion echoed from the hallway. A team of nurses was wheeling a hospital bed past my open door. It was Barbara, the mother of my husband. She had just come out of her own successful transplant surgery. But rather than expressing any gratitude toward the woman who had literally just saved her life, Barbara was loudly berating the nursing staff. "Why on earth is Diana placed in a private luxury suite?" Barbara snapped, her raspy voice easily carrying into my room. "She grew up in a filthy trailer park. Put her in the shared ward down the hall where she belongs. My son Bradley makes too much money to be paying for her unnecessary luxury. She should be grateful we even let her marry into our tax bracket." Those words perfectly encapsulated the past 5 years of marriage. 5 years of relentless classist abuse. 5 years of being treated like a disposable peasant who was never good enough for their prestigious family. I had paid off early career debts for Bradley with my own salary while he secretly hoarded his massive commissions. I had bent over backward to earn their approval, culminating in offering my own body parts when Barbara went into renal failure. And this was my reward. I looked from the hallway back to Bradley. "You are leaving me today?" I asked, my voice dry and raspy. "Right after I gave your mother my kidney?" Bradley adjusted his expensive watch, looking unbothered. "I am leaving you today," he confirmed. "And you need to sign those papers right now. I already filed the paperwork to retroactively cancel you as a dependent on my premium health insurance policy this morning. Cassidy is my new domestic partner, so she takes your spot on the coverage. You will have to figure out how to pay for this hospital stay yourself." He smiled, thinking he had executed the ultimate checkmate. He thought he had successfully drained me of my assets, my health, and my dignity. But Bradley, in his arrogant glory, forgot exactly what his wife did for a living. As a medical insurance fraud actuary, I spent days dissecting healthcare policies, transplant laws, and billing discrepancies. Right on cue, Dr. Thorne, the lead surgeon, walked into my room. He was accompanied by a stern woman holding a clipboard, the senior billing administrator. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Bradley, Dr. Thorne said, his tone icy. "We have a massive problem. I was informed you canceled your marital insurance policy this morning, retroactively removing your wife." "That is federal health insurance fraud," the billing administrator corrected sharply. "You cannot retroactively cancel coverage on the day of a major scheduled operation." But that is not even the biggest issue here. Because of strict matching protocols, the kidney did not go to your mother. We utilized the paired kidney exchange program. My kidney went to California. Your mother received an anonymous kidney. By committing fraudulent cancellation, you voided the coverage. Her transplant is uninsured. Your mother owes cash immediately, or the pharmacy halts her medications. Furthermore, our legal department placed an emergency hold on your assets. Your accounts are frozen. Bradley stared at me, his eyes completely wide and panicked as I smiled. My name is Diana, and 3 days passed in a blur of sterile hospital walls and agonizing physical therapy. My body felt like it had been split open and poorly stitched back together, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the cold reality of my situation. I was discharged on a rainy Thursday morning with a prescription for painkillers and a bruised spirit. I hailed a rideshare, my hands shaking, as I gave the driver the address to the suburban home Bradley and I had shared for 4 years. The drive felt endless. Every bump in the road sent a sharp jolt through my healing abdomen, but I forced myself to sit upright, determined to gather my belongings and leave this nightmare behind. I stepped out of the car and the cold wind immediately hit my face. My breath caught in my throat, not from the chill but from the sight waiting for me on the front lawn. Dozens of cheap black trash bags were piled indiscriminately near the curb, soaked from the morning rain. My carefully curated life, my clothes, my books, my professional documents had been tossed out like literal garbage. I clutched my side, taking a slow, agonizing step up the driveway. The heavy oak front door swung open and Cassidy stepped out onto the porch. She was wearing my expensive silk bathrobe, the one I had bought to celebrate my promotion last year, and casually sipping a latte from one of my favorite ceramic mugs. She looked down at me with a mixture of amusement and absolute disgust. "Bradley changed the locks yesterday morning," she announced, her voice carrying over the sound of the wind. "He owned this house before he married you, Diana. You get nothing. Run back to your trailer park and leave us alone." I stared at her, the sheer audacity of her presence leaving me momentarily speechless. I pointed to the black bags sinking into the muddy grass. "You threw my things in the dirt!" I asked, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. "I am 3 days post-operation. I do not even have the physical strength to lift those bags." Cassidy let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She walked down the porch steps, purposefully stepping on a bag that had ripped open, exposing my modest, worn-out office blouses. "That is your own fault," she gloated, kicking a gray sweater into the mud. "Look at these cheap rags. Bradley told me how you lived like a complete pauper just so you could pay off his early career debts. You spent every single dime of your salary clearing his student loans and paying for his expensive networking dinners because you thought it made you a supportive wife. Meanwhile, he was secretly hoarding every massive commission he made in his own private accounts. He built an empire while you were busy buying generic brand groceries and wearing discount shoes." Her words were designed to break me, but instead they ignited a fierce, burning clarity. She was right. I had sacrificed my own financial security to build Bradley up, believing we were a team. I had drained my savings to ensure he looked the part of a successful commercial real estate broker, only for him to use that very success to replace me with a younger model the second he secured his mother a new kidney. Cassidy took another sip of her latte, flashing that ridiculous 3-carat diamond ring at me again. "Now take your trash and get off my property before I call the police for trespassing." Before I could formulate a response, the low hum of a heavy engine broke through the tension. A sleek black luxury vehicle pulled smoothly into the driveway, tires crunching over the gravel. The driver's side door opened and Jamal stepped out. Jamal was an incredibly sharp corporate tax attorney, and more importantly, he was married to the older sister of my husband, Monica. As an African American man who had built his own wealth from the ground up, Jamal had always despised the thinly veiled racism and suffocating arrogance of his in-laws. He had always treated me with a quiet, respectful solidarity, recognizing that we were both outsiders in a family that valued superficial status over genuine human connection. Jamal did not even look at Cassidy. He walked straight past her, his imposing presence causing her to instinctively take a step back up the porch stairs. He looked down at me, his eyes softening with genuine concern as he took in my pale face and the way I was clutching my surgical wound. "I heard about what happened at the hospital," Jamal said, his voice steady and calm. "Monica is furious, but I knew you would need help right now. Come on, let us get you out of this freezing rain." Without waiting for a response, Jamal began swiftly and carefully loading the heavy black trash bags into the spacious trunk of his vehicle. Cassidy stood on the porch, her mouth open in indignation, but she lacked the courage to challenge a prominent attorney who knew exactly how much her new boyfriend was worth. Within minutes, my entire life was packed away. Jamal gently guided me into the passenger seat, turning up the heat to warm my shivering body. As he climbed into the driver's seat and pulled away from the house I had once called home, I finally let out a long, shuddering breath. "Thank you, Jamal," I whispered, staring out the window at the passing suburban streets. "I had no idea how I was going to carry those bags. I do not even know where I am going to go." "You are going to a secure hotel downtown," Jamal said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I already booked the room and paid for the first month, but that is not why I came to find you today." We reached a red light, and Jamal shifted the car into park. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small sealed envelope. He handed it to me, his expression turning deadly serious. "I audit the commercial real estate firm where Bradley works to ensure their tax compliance," Jamal whispered, glancing around as if someone might be listening. "I have access to their deepest financial records. When I heard he bought Cassidy a $100,000 diamond ring, I knew something was wrong. Bradley is cheap. He would never spend his own hoarded commissions on a piece of jewelry. So I did some digging. I found out exactly how he bought that ring, Diana. He did not use his money. He used yours." My brow furrowed in confusion. I tore open the envelope. Inside was a small silver flash drive. "My money," I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I do not have $100,000. Bradley made sure my accounts were drained, paying for our living expenses." Jamal just shook his head. "Plug it into your laptop when you get to the hotel. You need to see this with your own eyes. Bradley has crossed a line that goes far beyond simple divorce." The rest of the drive was a blur of anxiety and physical exhaustion. Jamal carried my bags up to a beautiful, spacious suite on the 15th floor of a luxury downtown hotel. He made sure I had food, water, and emergency contact numbers before leaving me to rest. But sleep was the furthest thing from my mind. Despite the searing pain in my side, I pulled my laptop from one of the trash bags, plugged it into the wall, and inserted the silver flash drive. My fingers trembled over the trackpad as I opened the only folder on the drive. It was labeled with the name of my husband and a string of account numbers. I clicked on the first document, a high-resolution scan of a bank authorization form. My eyes darted across the complex financial jargon, my background as a fraud actuary, immediately kicking in to decipher the numbers. My heart stopped. My eyes widened in absolute horror as the reality of the document sank in. It was an application for a massive bank loan taken out against the value of the suburban house I had just been evicted from. The loan was for $300,000. But the house was solely in his name. I had no legal right to it. Yet right there on the bottom line, signed as a co-borrower, to assume exactly half of the crushing debt, was my signature. Bradley had forged my name to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars legally, tying me to a catastrophic financial burden. And the nightmare was only just beginning. My phone vibrated against the hotel nightstand, jolting me from the documents glowing on my laptop screen. A new message glared from the locked display. It was Bradley. He wanted to meet at a busy coffee shop downtown in 1 hour to settle things quietly. The audacity of his timing was staggering. I was running on zero sleep and my surgical incision burned with every breath, but my mind had never been sharper. I closed my laptop, securing Jamal's flash drive in my purse. I slipped into a tailored blazer that hid the slight hunch in my posture caused by the surgical pain. I was not going to let Bradley see me bleed. The downtown cafe was packed with the mid-morning corporate crowd. The hum of espresso machines and overlapping conversations provided the perfect cover for a confrontation. Bradley was already sitting in a corner booth wearing a custom Italian suit I had paid for 3 years ago. He did not stand when I approached. He simply pushed a stapled packet of legal papers across the polished wood table. "Sign the debt assumption agreement, Diana," he commanded without a greeting. "I am being generous here. You take on $50,000 of the marital credit card debt, and I will not drag this divorce out in court. If you refuse, I will deliberately default on the accounts. I will destroy your pristine credit score so badly you will not even be able to rent an apartment." I stared at the thick packet. He was completely oblivious to the fact that I already knew about his larger financial crimes. He thought a $50,000 threat would terrify me into submission. I flagged down a passing waiter and calmly ordered a black coffee. I did not touch his paperwork. Instead, I reached into my purse and pulled out a single sheet of paper. I slid it across the table, placing it directly on top of his ridiculous demand. "You thought you were smart, Bradley," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "But that luxury speedboat you love showing off to your clients every weekend? The title was strictly in my name. I sold it to a marine dealership an hour ago for $60,000 to cover my medical recovery expenses." Bradley stared at the bill of sale, his smug expression shattering instantly. His face flushed a deep mottled red as the reality of my words registered. "You did what?" he hissed, his voice cracking. "You had no right to touch that boat. I need that boat for the summer regatta. I have 3 massive commercial real estate developers flying in next month, and I promised to host them on the water. How am I supposed to entertain my wealthy golf buddies now?" "You can entertain them in a rented canoe for all I care," I replied, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "You seem to forget how you got that boat in the first place. You begged me to use my spotless credit history to secure the financing because your own debt-to-income ratio was a toxic disaster. You needed the boat to maintain your fake billionaire persona, but you could not actually afford it. Since I held the title and my name was on the loan, it was my property to liquidate." Bradley gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. "You vindictive little trailer park trash," he spat, leaning across the table until I could smell the mints on his breath. "You think you can outplay me because you sold a toy?" I did not flinch. I just smiled. It felt incredibly satisfying to watch his carefully constructed facade of superiority crumble in the middle of a crowded room. "You spent 5 years treating me like an unpaid assistant," I said. "You hoarded your commissions while I paid off your early career debts. You literally took my kidney for your ungrateful mother and then discarded me the same day. Selling your boat is not vindictive, Bradley. It is severance pay." Bradley took a deep breath, forcibly smoothing his features into a mask of cold calculation. He leaned back in the booth, crossing his arms. A wicked, sinister smile slowly spread across his face, replacing his initial panic. "Sell the boat, Diana," he said, his tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I do not care. You think $60,000 makes you a player in this game? You are completely out of your league. Last week I took out a $300,000 home equity line of credit on our house. Since we are still legally married, the court will classify it as joint marital debt regardless of whose name is on the deed. You owe $150,000 of it, sweetheart." He stared at me, waiting for the devastation to hit my face. He wanted me to panic, to beg, to break down crying in the middle of the coffee shop. Instead, the puzzle pieces locked together in my analytical mind with absolute clarity. The loan documents I had seen on Jamal's flash drive the night before were not just random debts. Bradley had pulled $300,000 of equity out of a house he owned to fund his new life. That was exactly how he afforded Cassidy's massive diamond engagement ring. It was how he was paying for his mother's upcoming luxury recovery party at her country club. He was literally financing his betrayal and his mother's lavish lifestyle by attempting to shackle me with massive fraudulent debt. He thought he had checkmated me. He thought the revelation of the $300,000 joint debt would crush my spirit and force me to submit to his demands. He had absolutely no idea that I already knew the notary stamp on his loan documents was a verifiable federal crime. I looked at Bradley, my expression entirely unreadable. We will see what the courts have to say about that. I left Bradley sitting in that booth, his face a mask of silent fury. Walking back to my hotel room, my mind raced with possibilities. A home equity line of credit required a massive amount of paperwork, strict identity verification, and most importantly, notarized signatures from both spouses. I knew I had not signed anything. The sheer audacity of his move meant he had to have left a paper trail of fraud. I opened my laptop and pulled up the encrypted files Jamal had provided on the flash drive. My eyes scanned the digitized pages of the bank loan application. As a medical insurance fraud actuary, I spent my days dissecting complex billing codes, analyzing policy loopholes, and hunting down the tiniest discrepancies in hundreds of pages of legal text. A sloppy real estate broker and his arrogant mistress were no match for my professional scrutiny. I zoomed in on the final page of the loan agreement. There was my signature completely forged. The loops and angles were entirely wrong, a frantic imitation of my handwriting. But the signature was not the fatal mistake. The fatal mistake was located at the bottom right corner of the page. It was the notary public stamp complete with a state registration number and a signature of verification. The notary name printed in bold black ink was Cassidy. I stared at the screen, a cold laugh escaping my lips. Cassidy had used her official state notary license to verify that I had presented my identification and signed that document in her physical presence. I moved my cursor to the timestamp next to her official seal. The document was logged and digitally stamped at exactly 10:30 in the morning last Tuesday. Last Tuesday at 10:30 in the morning, I was under general anesthesia in an operating room at Chicago Memorial Hospital. A team of surgeons had my abdomen sliced open to extract my left kidney. It was a physical and medical impossibility for me to be sitting in a commercial real estate office signing bank loans. Cassidy had just handed me a slam-dunk felony conviction on a silver platter. She had committed notary fraud, wire fraud, and identity theft all in one careless stroke of a pen. I immediately forwarded the digital file to Jamal, adding a brief note outlining the exact timeline of my surgery. We had them trapped. Bradley must have realized he had miscalculated. He knew I would not just roll over and accept $150,000 of fraudulent debt. He also knew my career was my lifeline. Since he had already locked me out of my house and drained my personal checking accounts, destroying my employment was his logical next step. The following morning, my phone buzzed with an urgent text from my department director, Arthur. He demanded I report to his office the second I arrived at work. My stomach clenched. In the corporate actuarial world, an emergency meeting with the director usually meant severe disciplinary action. I walked into the high-rise office building feeling a familiar wave of anxiety. Bradley had always tried to convince me that my career was insignificant, and now he was actively trying to tear it down. I knocked on the heavy glass door of the corporate office and stepped inside. He was sitting behind his desk, his expression incredibly stern. He motioned for me to close the door and take a seat. "We received a very disturbing phone call this morning," Diana Arthur said, crossing his arms over his chest. "It was from your husband. He claimed that you have been going through a severe mental breakdown since your surgery. He also alleged that you downloaded sensitive client data and HIPAA-protected medical files onto a personal flash drive to use for blackmail in your upcoming divorce." My blood ran cold. Bradley was trying to frame me for corporate espionage. Stealing protected health information would not just get me fired, it would strip me of my actuary license and potentially land me in federal prison. He was projecting his own criminal behavior onto me, trying to strike a fatal blow before I could expose his forged bank loan. I took a deep breath, preparing to defend myself. "Arthur, I can explain. My husband is attempting to cover up massive financial fraud." Arthur held up his hand, stopping me instantly. He pressed a button on his keyboard. The panicked, manipulative voice of Bradley filled the room, weaving a masterful lie about my supposed instability and corporate theft. Arthur let the recording play for a full minute before stopping it. He looked directly into my eyes, and the stern lines on his face relaxed into a sharp, calculating smile. "Your husband is a terrible liar," Diana Arthur said, "and he is incredibly stupid." I blinked, completely caught off guard. "You do not believe him?" Arthur leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Our firm insures the hospital where your mother-in-law received her transplant. When Bradley retroactively canceled your marital insurance policy to commit fraud last week, it triggered an automatic high-priority alert in our system. We flagged his name across our entire database. Do you honestly think I would believe a man who is currently under review by our own compliance department?" I sat frozen in my chair. The scope of Bradley and his mistakes was expanding faster than I could have ever predicted. He had inadvertently drawn the attention of one of the largest insurance corporations in the country. Arthur slid a thick red classified folder across his desk toward me. "We started looking into his commercial real estate firm after the insurance flag. We suspect Bradley is involved in a massive wire fraud scheme. He has been manipulating escrow accounts, leveraging fraudulent loans, and laundering the funds through offshore corporate entities. He thought he could use our company policies to cover his tracks." Arthur tapped the red folder. "We are launching an internal investigation." I nodded at Arthur, feeling the corporate machine aligning behind me. Leading the internal investigation gave me access to every financial transaction Bradley executed over the past 6 months. By Friday afternoon, I traced every penny of the fraudulent $300,000 home equity line of credit. He did not just pay for a diamond ring. He wired $50,000 directly to his mother. Barbara used stolen money to throw a lavish garden party celebrating her successful transplant. The absolute audacity of throwing a party while actively defaulting on an $850,000 hospital bill was staggering. I knew where I needed to be on Saturday night. The air was thick with the scent of catered seafood and imported champagne as I walked up the illuminated driveway of Barbara's sprawling estate. A massive outdoor projector screen displayed a slideshow of her smiling with Bradley. I chose my outfit with meticulous care. I wore a stunning emerald green form-fitting dress, featuring an asymmetrical cutout along the waistline. The strategic design perfectly framed my fresh surgical scar. It was a raw, jagged badge of honor, contrasting violently with the superficial vanity of the guests mingling in their pastel summer suits and flawless makeup. I grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and stepped directly onto the main patio. The music seemed to falter as heads turned in my direction. Barbara was standing near an ice sculpture of a kidney, wearing a ridiculous sequined gown. Her smile vanished the second her eyes locked onto mine. Instead of shrinking away, I stood taller, letting the patio lights catch the angry red tissue of my incision. Barbara slammed her crystal flute onto a nearby table and turned to her wealthy country club friends, her voice booming intentionally loud enough for half the yard to hear. "Look at her," Barbara sneered, pointing a manicured finger in my direction. "She always ruins our high-class events. I told Bradley from day one she does not belong in our tax bracket. She grew up in dirt and she still acts like it. Look at her parading around half-naked, trying to make everyone uncomfortable with that hideous scar. We gave her a chance to elevate herself by marrying into this family, and she repays us by showing up uninvited to my celebration to beg for attention." Her tirade was the perfect encapsulation of the psychological abuse she had inflicted on me for years. Every holiday dinner, every family milestone, she had used her wealth as a weapon to remind me I was merely a peasant allowed to sit at their royal table. But her words lacked their usual sting. Tonight, they just sounded like the desperate ramblings of a woman completely disconnected from reality. Before Barbara could summon security, Cassidy strutted through the crowd. She wore a white designer cocktail dress that probably cost more than my first car, and clung to Bradley's arm. Bradley looked completely panicked, his eyes darting from my face to the cutout exposing my scar. Cassidy, however, looked thrilled. She let go of Bradley and marched right up to me, digging into her glittering clutch. "Diana!" You really need to learn when to quit, Cassidy said, a condescending smirk painted across her face. Since you are newly unemployed and clearly desperate for cash, I have a job for you. She pulled out a crisp $20 bill and shoved it against my chest. Why don't you make yourself useful and go valet park the cars for the real guests? I'm sure you are used to manual labor. I did not take the money. I let the bill flutter to the stone patio floor. I looked past Cassidy, locking eyes with Bradley, whose face had turned the color of ash. He knew I was not there to beg. I stepped around Cassidy, moving with a calm, deliberate purpose toward the live band playing on the raised wooden stage. The lead singer looked confused as I stepped up and gently pulled the microphone from the stand. I walked over to the audio-visual technician managing the slideshow on the massive outdoor screen. I handed him the silver flash drive Jamal had given me. Play the first file, I instructed, my voice brooking no argument. The technician, intimidated by my tone, immediately complied. The saccharine photos of Barbara vanished. In their place, towering 15 feet high, illuminated against the night sky, was the fraudulent bank loan document. The massive numbers, the forged signature, and Cassidy's notary stamp were broadcast for every single guest to see. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of elite socialites. Thank you all for coming tonight, I announced, my voice echoing cleanly over the premium surround sound speakers. I hope you are all enjoying the imported seafood and the vintage champagne. Please drink up, because this entire party was paid for by a fraudulent $300,000 bank loan. I gestured toward the giant screen. As you can see, my husband forged my signature to steal equity from a home I am not legally entitled to. And the brilliant young woman who notarized this felony fraud is Cassidy, standing right there. I pointed directly at her. She stamped this official legal document verifying my physical presence at exactly 10:30 in the morning last Tuesday. The crowd began to murmur frantically, backing away from Bradley and Cassidy. I took a step closer to the edge of the stage, letting the spotlight hit my scarred waistline. That timestamp is incredibly interesting, I continued, my voice rising over the panicked whispers. Because at 10:30 last Tuesday morning, I was unconscious. I was literally bleeding on an operating table, having my kidney violently extracted to save the life of the host. Barbara let out a sharp, terrified shriek. Bradley lunged toward the stage but froze. The distinctive, piercing wail of police sirens echoed through the quiet suburban neighborhood, rapidly approaching the mansion gates. Red and blue lights from 3 police cruisers sliced through the hedges, casting frantic shadows across the patio. Uniformed officers strode through the gates, hands resting on their utility belts. Barbara lunged forward, her sequined gown glittering in the police lights. "Arrest her!" Barbara shrieked. "She is trespassing on private property. She is harassing my guests and ruining my recovery celebration. Get this trailer park trash out of my sight." The lead officer, a tall man with a stern jawline, did not glance in my direction. He walked right past Barbara and stopped directly in front of Cassidy. Cassidy took a shaky step backward, the color draining entirely from her face. "Cassidy Vance," the officer stated, his voice booming over the stunned whispers of the crowd. "We have a warrant for your arrest." Cassidy let out a pathetic gasp as a second officer stepped behind her and firmly grasped her wrists. "You are under arrest for felony notary fraud, forgery, and identity theft." The officer continued, pulling steel handcuffs from his belt. The sharp click of metal locking around her wrists echoed loudly in the silence of the garden. Cassidy twisted her head, her eyes wide with absolute terror as she looked at Bradley. "Bradley," she pleaded, her voice trembling violently. Tell them you told me to stamp it while she was in the hospital. Do something, Bradley." Bradley backed away from her. He held his hands up in a gesture of surrender, his eyes darting toward the approaching officers. "I have no idea what she is talking about," Bradley declared, his voice shaking with cowardice. "She acted entirely alone. I thought my wife signed those loan papers. I had no idea Cassidy forged the signature and abused her notary license. I am a victim here too." The betrayal shattered across Cassidy's face. Her mouth opened in a silent scream of realization. The man who promised her endless luxury, the man who bought her a diamond ring with stolen money, was throwing her under the bus without hesitation, to save his own skin. She began to thrash against the officers, tears ruining her flawless makeup as she screamed curses at Bradley, calling him a pathetic coward. The police ignored her frantic protests forcibly, marching her across the lawn and shoving her into the back of a waiting cruiser. The elite socialites did not wait around to see what happened next. The wealthy guests fled the patio in droves, abandoning their champagne glasses and plates of expensive catered seafood. Within minutes, the lavish garden party was a ghost town of discarded luxury. Barbara collapsed into a patio chair, sobbing hysterically, as her pristine reputation disintegrated before her eyes. I turned to leave, perfectly content to let the authorities handle the rest, but Bradley stepped directly into my path. He blocked the exit to the driveway, his chest heaving. The panic that had consumed him moments ago was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating malice. "You really think you won this, Diana?" he snarled, stepping aggressively into my personal space. "You think sending my idiot girlfriend to jail makes you the ultimate victor? You are completely delusional. That insurance investigation you triggered caused the bank to instantly call in the massive loan. They are foreclosing on the house tomorrow morning." I held my ground, refusing to show even a fraction of intimidation. "You committed wire fraud, Bradley. You are going to lose your precious broker license." Bradley laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "I do not care about the license. I already saw the writing on the wall the second my accounts were frozen. I spent the last 3 days moving every liquid asset I have into untraceable offshore accounts under a proxy name. I am untouchable. The bank is going to seize the house, and because you are still legally my wife, your name will be dragged through the mud right alongside mine. You are going to be completely homeless, buried in unpayable debt, and utterly ruined. I am walking away clean, and you are going down with the sinking ship." He smiled, stepping aside and making a grand mocking gesture toward the dark driveway. "Have a nice life back in the trailer park, Diana." I walked away without giving him the satisfaction of a verbal response. My heels clicked steadily against the pavement as I left the sprawling estate behind forever. I reached the quiet street where I had parked my rental car, but I was not alone. Jamal was leaning against the hood of his black SUV parked directly behind my vehicle. He was illuminated by a nearby streetlight holding a thick corporate binder. He watched the flashing police cruisers pull away in the distance, a deeply satisfied smile crossing his face. "I saw the spectacular fireworks from here," Jamal said, stepping forward as I approached. "Monica sends her best regards. But we have a much more pressing matter to handle now." He handed me the corporate file. I took it, feeling the immense weight of the legal documents inside. "Bradley thinks he outsmarted you." Jamal continued, his tone shifting into pure, focused business. "He thinks the bank is going to auction the house tomorrow morning to a random bidder, leaving you completely homeless and financially crippled for decades. But Bradley is just a commercial broker. He only understands commercial leasing. He does not understand distressed residential debt." I looked down at the thick file in my hands, my heart beginning to race with a new thrilling realization. Jamal tapped the heavy cover of the binder. "He does not realize that under commercial banking law, anyone with a registered LLC can buy the distressed debt directly from the bank before it ever hits the public auction block. I registered a holding company in your name yesterday, Diana. You are not going to be homeless. You are going to buy his debt for pennies on the dollar, and then you are going to become your cheating husband's new landlord." I stared at the thick corporate binder in my hands, feeling the heavy weight of absolute victory. Jamal smiled knowingly, stepping back into his vehicle as the night air suddenly felt crisp and refreshing. By 9 in the morning, the LLC Jamal created for me officially purchased the distressed debt on the suburban house. I was now legally my cheating husband's landlord, and the bank was entirely off his back. But Bradley had much bigger problems looming on the horizon because the hospital administration had absolutely zero patience for federal insurance fraud. The retroactive cancellation of his premium policy left his mother completely uninsured for a major organ transplant. The hospital billing department did not even bother sending Barbara a polite warning letter. They immediately handed her $850,000 medical debt over to an ultra-aggressive medical collection agency known for their ruthless tactics. The fallout was instantaneous and brutal. My cell phone vibrated violently on my desk at the actuarial firm on a Tuesday afternoon. The caller identification flashed with Barbara's name. I let it ring 3 times before calmly tapping the answer button and putting her on speakerphone. A loud, hysterical sobbing echoed through my quiet office. "Diana, you have to help us!" Barbara wailed, her voice cracking with manufactured panic. "You have to call the hospital and fix this insurance mess right now. They are demanding nearly $1 million in cash. We are family, Diana. You have to cash out your retirement accounts to save me. I carry a piece of you inside me." I leaned back in my ergonomic desk chair, listening to her pathetic attempt at emotional manipulation. The sheer entitlement of a woman who had mocked my upbringing and tried to banish me to a shared recovery ward was astounding. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the icy precision of a fraud investigator. "You carry the kidney of a complete stranger from California, Barbara," I stated flatly. "My kidney went to a 6-year-old girl through the paired exchange program because you were not a match. You owe me nothing and I owe you less. Do not ever call this number again." I pressed end call, dropping the phone face down on my desk. Barbara realized very quickly that the collection agency did not care about her prestigious social standing. 2 days after our phone call, a pair of heavy tow trucks pulled up the sweeping, circular driveway of her manicured estate. The aggressive collection agents marched straight to the front door, demanding immediate collateral for the outstanding $850,000 debt. Barbara stood on her front porch, screaming in her silk bathrobe, as the repo men hitched up her brand-new silver Porsche and the vintage Mercedes Bradley kept parked in her garage. They completely ignored her threats to call the police, simply handing her a court-ordered seizure notice. The physical repossession of her luxury vehicles was only the beginning of her rapid financial destruction. By Friday morning, the collection agency secured a judicial order to freeze every single one of Barbara's personal checking and savings accounts. The timing could not have been more perfectly disastrous. She was scheduled to host her weekly ladies' luncheon at the elite Oakwood Country Club. She arrived in a cheap rideshare, attempting to hide her lack of a vehicle by claiming her Porsche was simply in the shop for detailing. She ordered expensive champagne and imported caviar for a table of 8 wealthy socialites, laughing loudly and pretending her life was completely intact. When the server brought the final bill, Barbara casually handed over her platinum credit card. The server returned 3 minutes later with the manager. The manager loudly informed Barbara that her card was declined and that her country club membership was effectively revoked due to a series of bounced checks earlier that week. Her wealthy friends stared in shocked silence as Barbara was publicly humiliated and escorted off the premises by club security, desperate to salvage his mother's shattered reputation and prevent her from losing the estate itself. Bradley finally decided to tap into his hidden reserves. He had spent the last week bragging about his untraceable offshore accounts, convinced he had outsmarted the American banking system. He locked himself in his new rented downtown apartment, opening his secure laptop to initiate a massive wire transfer. He planned to liquidate a large portion of his cryptocurrency portfolio to bail Barbara out and pay off the aggressive collection agency. He navigated through the complex layers of security protocols, typing his heavily encrypted passwords with trembling fingers. He hit the final execution command, waiting for the digital confirmation of his brilliance. Instead, a stark red error message flashed across his high-definition screen. Bradley frantically refreshed the page, assuming it was a simple network glitch. The same red warning message appeared, but this time it was accompanied by an official government seal. His access had been completely denied by a federal injunction. Every single digital coin, every hidden offshore asset, every cent he had illegally funneled out of his commercial real estate firm was frozen solid. The screen explicitly stated that the accounts were under active investigation by the Internal Revenue Service for severe tax evasion and money laundering. Bradley stared at the screen, his breath catching in his throat as the realization struck him. Someone with intimate knowledge of his financial structure and commercial audits had tipped off the federal government. He knew that only one person had the skills, the access, and the fierce motivation to dismantle his entire empire so flawlessly. Jamal had delivered the final blow. Bradley sank to his knees in the empty apartment, staring blankly at the flashing screen. The arrogant billionaire facade was completely obliterated, leaving behind a ruined man who was about to lose absolutely everything to the wife he betrayed and thought he could discard like a piece of useless old garbage forever now. The red warning text on Bradley's monitor continued to flash, casting a harsh glow across his pale face. Before he could process the magnitude of the federal injunction locking him out of his offshore accounts, his phone began vibrating violently against the floor. The caller ID displayed his sister's name. Monica never called during business hours unless it was an absolute emergency. Bradley snatched the phone, a desperate flicker of hope igniting deep within. Monica was married to Jamal, a high-level corporate attorney with top-tier security clearances. If anyone could navigate a federal freeze, it was Jamal. Bradley answered, ready to spin a fabricated story, but Monica did not even say hello. She coldly demanded his immediate presence at her penthouse for a mandatory family meeting and hung up. Bradley arrived at the luxurious high-rise 40 minutes later, desperately trying to smooth his wrinkled suit and project his usual untouchable arrogance. He expected to find his sister worried about his financial predicament. Instead, he walked into the expansive living room and froze. Monica stood at the head of a massive oak dining table, her posture rigid and her expression utterly devoid of warmth. Jamal stood silently behind her, his arms crossed, projecting an impenetrable wall of legal authority. My presence in the room was the final shock to Bradley's system. I sat quietly in a leather armchair holding a cup of black coffee, watching his arrogant facade crack. His mother Barbara sat rigidly on the opposite sofa, her eyes swollen and red, entirely stripped of the elitism that defined her existence. Bradley forced a weak, condescending smile. He spread his hands in a gesture of false innocence, stepping into the room as if he still owned the world. He opened his mouth to speak, but Monica cut him off. She reached down and hoisted a thick leather-bound ledger from the floor, slamming it down onto the center of the oak table with a deafening crack. The heavy sound echoed through the quiet penthouse, making Barbara flinch visibly. Monica stared directly into her brother's eyes, her voice vibrating with a lethal, contained fury. She announced that Jamal had utilized his highest legal clearances to conduct a comprehensive forensic audit of the family estate trust left by their late father. Bradley's forced smile instantly vanished. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. Monica did not pause to let him breathe. She slammed her hand against the ledger, stating that the numbers were indisputable. Bradley had not merely committed wire fraud, manipulated commercial real estate loans, or stolen equity from his wife. He had been systematically bleeding his own family dry. For 5 years, he had been illegally siphoning massive amounts of capital from Monica's half of the inheritance. He used their deceased father's legacy to fund his extravagant lifestyle, his luxury vehicles, and his pathetic affair with Cassidy. The room was suffocatingly tense. Bradley glanced frantically at the ledger, then at Jamal, and finally at me. Recognizing he was cornered, he fell back on the only defense mechanism he knew. He let out a harsh, patronizing laugh, shaking his head as if dealing with a petulant child. He stepped toward the table, adopting the exact same condescending tone he used to terrorize me for years. He told Monica to lower her voice, claiming she was being far too emotional to grasp reality. He waved a hand dismissively at the ledger, stating she simply did not understand complex commercial business structures or asset liquidity. He insisted the money was just temporarily leveraged to yield higher dividends. I sat in my chair and took a slow sip of my coffee, watching the scene unfold with absolute clarity. It was the exact same sexist, manipulative rhetoric he had weaponized against me whenever I questioned our household finances or his late nights at the office. He always branded women as too emotional or intellectually inferior to comprehend his brilliant financial strategies. He expected Monica to shrink back, doubt herself, and defer to his patriarchal authority. Monica did not shrink. She stepped around the table, closing the distance between them until she was inches from his face. She informed him in a voice as cold as ice that she understood business perfectly well, and she certainly understood felony embezzlement. She told him that his days of manipulating the women in his life to subsidize his fragile ego were permanently over. Without breaking eye contact, Monica reached her hand back. Jamal stepped forward and placed a crisp, legally binding document into her palm. She shoved the papers directly into Bradley's chest. It was a formal, notarized injunction. Monica had officially and legally revoked Bradley's status as the primary executor of their father's estate trust. Jamal stated firmly that the documentation had already been filed with the state courts and approved by a judge that very morning. The legal severance was absolute and immediate. Bradley was entirely stripped of his power, his title, and his access to any future family wealth. Barbara let out a pathetic whimper from the sofa, trying to interject, begging Monica to reconsider and keep the family united. Monica snapped her head toward her mother, silencing her instantly with a glare that promised absolute ruin if she dared to defend him. Barbara shrank back into the upholstery, finally realizing she had bet her entire future on the wrong child. Bradley stood trembling, clutching the revocation papers. The offshore accounts were frozen by the federal government. His commercial broker license was under severe investigation. The stolen home equity was now owned by my holding company. Now the family trust was permanently locked away from him. He was completely stripped of his capital, his safety net, and his enablers. Bradley looked up, his eyes darting frantically around the room, realizing he was entirely isolated. He was no longer a businessman playing a game. He was a cornered animal with absolutely nothing left to lose, leaving him desperate, unpredictable, and incredibly dangerous. 3 weeks later, that exact desperation materialized inside a stifling pretrial hearing room at the downtown family court. The heavy doors clicked shut, sealing us inside for the divorce proceedings. I sat beside my attorney, perfectly composed, wearing a sharp charcoal blazer. Across the table, Bradley slouched. He looked unkempt. His suit was wrinkled, and the arrogant smirk he usually wore had been replaced by a malicious scowl. Sitting beside him was his new legal counsel, a sleazy defense attorney named Vance, who built his career out of aggressive intimidation tactics and burying opposing parties in frivolous paperwork. The presiding judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics, called the session to order. Vance immediately launched his prepared ambush. He stood up and slid a stack of aggressively drafted demands across the table. He did not ask for a simple division of assets. He demanded I pay Bradley $5,000 a month in permanent spousal support. The sheer audacity of the demand echoed in the quiet room. Vance paced, projecting his voice to ensure the judge heard every fabricated grievance. He claimed that my actions at the garden party constituted malicious public defamation. He spun a pathetic narrative portraying Bradley as a broken man, suffering from severe emotional distress. According to Vance, my calculated sabotage had completely destroyed his client's pristine professional reputation. As a direct result of this alleged ruin, Bradley had been unceremoniously fired from his commercial real estate firm. Vance argued that because I was a lucrative medical actuary, I was legally obligated to maintain Bradley's standard of living while he recovered from the trauma I inflicted. Bradley stared at me, producing a forced look of absolute victimhood for the judge. He was trying to weaponize my career success against me. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with Bradley. I simply reached down and unsnapped the latches of my briefcase. As a fraud actuary, my professional life revolved around dissecting impenetrable walls of data. I spent years uncovering sophisticated embezzlement rings and destroying complex corporate loopholes. Vance and Bradley thought they could blindside me with a fabricated sob story about a lost job. They forgot who they were dealing with. I pulled out a meticulously organized 50-page forensic audit and dropped it squarely onto the table. I slid a duplicate copy directly to the judge. My husband did not lose his job. Your Honor, I stated, my voice cutting through the tension like a steel blade. He is actively committing perjury in your courtroom right now. Vance stopped pacing, his face flushing red. He attempted to object, claiming my documents were inadmissible, but the judge held up her hand, silencing him instantly as she opened the binder. I directed the judge to the highlighted logs on page 12. I explained my forensic auditing software tracked the digital footprints of Bradley and his managing broker. I proved definitively that Bradley was not fired. He colluded with his boss to engineer a temporary layoff. They backdated a termination letter to make it appear as though he lost his income following the garden party. I presented intercepted internal emails explicitly outlining their plan to hide his income during our divorce. The emails detailed exactly when Bradley would be rehired with a massive sign-on bonus designed to reimburse him for his fake unemployment. Bradley gripped the edges of the table, his knuckles turning completely white. The victim facade evaporated, revealing the seething rage boiling underneath. But I was not finished. I instructed the judge to flip to page 35. The escalation of his crimes extended far beyond a fake termination letter. I continued. When Bradley realized he was investigated for home equity fraud, he began liquidating marital assets. He claimed to lose savings in poor investments, but that is a calculated lie. I laid out the exact wire routing numbers. I showed the judge how Bradley systematically siphoned $400,000 of our joint marital funds over the last month. He funneled the cash through domestic holding companies before parking the money in an offshore shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. I provided digital signature logs, proving Bradley was the sole beneficiary of the offshore account. He hid our shared wealth while simultaneously sitting in a courtroom demanding I pay his living expenses. The judge lowered the binder. The room temperature plummeted as she fixed a furious glare directly on Bradley. Vance shrank back into his chair, furiously shuffling papers to distance himself from his client's blatant perjury. The judge did not hold back. She unleashed a scathing reprimand, slamming Bradley for attempting to manipulate the judicial system and commit fraud in her presence. She unequivocally denied the ridiculous request for spousal support. Furthermore, she ruled that because Bradley had intentionally hidden marital assets and engaged in documented perjury, he was immediately ordered to pay my legal fees. The sound of the judge's gavel hitting the block was the most satisfying noise I had ever heard. I packed my briefcase, snapping the latches shut with a crisp feeling of triumph. I stood up ready to walk out a free woman. Bradley did not move. He remained seated, glaring at me with pure, unadulterated venom. As I turned toward the doors, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He let out a dark, sneering laugh. "Good luck collecting those legal fees," Diana Bradley sneered, his voice dripping with spite. "You can hand this judgment to whatever debt collector you want, but it is completely useless. I am officially bankrupt. There is absolutely nothing left for you to take. And as for that house you fought so hard to protect, you are out of time. The commercial bank is foreclosing on the residential property at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning tomorrow." The morning air was biting as Bradley sped his rented sedan down the suburban streets toward his former marital home. The dashboard clock glowed 8:15. He had 45 minutes before the commercial bank officially seized the property and locked the doors forever. His pulse hammered against his ribs. He did not care about the house itself. The sprawling estate was just another casualty of his ruined financial empire. His sole focus was the primary suite. Hidden securely behind the custom mahogany bookshelf in the master closet was a biometric wall safe. It contained the last untraceable assets he possessed: stacks of high-denomination European bearer bonds, a velvet pouch filled with conflict-free diamonds, and a ledger detailing dummy corporations he could use to start over. He needed to slip inside, extract the contents, and vanish before the bank executives arrived to change the locks. He turned the final corner and aggressively mashed the brake pedal. The sedan screeched to a halt at the edge of the circular driveway. Bradley stared through the windshield, his jaw slackening in pure confusion. Two massive private security guards stood squarely on the front porch. They wore tactical black uniforms and stood with their hands clasped firmly behind their backs. A heavy steel chain linked the wrought iron gates at the bottom of the driveway, forcing Bradley to abandon his vehicle on the public street. He threw open his car door and marched up the paved walkway. He assumed the bank had simply sent a private firm to secure the premises early. He adjusted his collar, preparing to use his former status to intimidate the hired muscle into granting him access. "You men are early," Bradley barked, gesturing dismissively toward the front door. "The foreclosure injunction does not take effect until 9 o'clock. I am the homeowner and I need to retrieve personal documents before the bank representatives arrive. Step aside." The guards did not blink. They did not move to accommodate his demand. They stared straight through him, standing like statues blocking the entryway. Bradley felt his blood pressure spike. He opened his mouth to shout a threat involving trespassing violations. Before a single word left his throat, the heavy mahogany door clicked open. Diana stepped onto the porch. She wore a tailored ivory cashmere sweater and crisp slacks. Both hands were wrapped comfortably around a steaming ceramic mug of dark roast coffee. She took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the silence stretch between them. She looked down at Bradley from the elevated porch, her expression perfectly serene. "What are you doing here?" Bradley demanded, his voice cracking with a mixture of shock and volatile anger. "You have absolutely no legal right to be on this property. The divorce settlement has not even been finalized yet. The bank is seizing this house in 30 minutes. You are trespassing." Diana smiled. It was the sharp, calculated smile of an apex predator. She casually passed her coffee mug to the security guard standing on her left. The guard accepted it with a respectful nod. Diana reached into her blazer pocket and withdrew a folded legal document. She descended the first 3 steps, stopping just out of Bradley's reach. She flicked her wrist, unfolding the thick parchment paper so the official seals faced him directly. "You are mistaken, Bradley," Diana said, her voice echoing clearly across the lawn. "The bank does not own this house anymore." Bradley stared at the document. His eyes darted across the bold print, struggling to comprehend the terminology. "This is impossible," he stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the paperwork. "I defaulted on the commercial loans. The injunction was absolute. No one could clear that debt in time." "You always underestimated the mechanics of distressed asset liquidation," Diana replied smoothly. "Yesterday afternoon, an anonymous limited liability company approached your commercial lenders. The bank was desperate to offload your toxic debt to avoid reporting a massive loss to their shareholders. The anonymous LLC offered to purchase the entirety of your distressed debt. Knowing your accounts were frozen and you had zero liquid capital, they gladly accepted the buyout. They sold your debt for pennies on the dollar." Bradley swallowed hard. His chest heaved as his mind raced to process the implications of her words. He looked from the deed to Diana, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. "An anonymous LLC," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "Who bought it?" Diana took a step closer, holding the property deed inches from his face. She tapped the ownership line with her manicured index finger. "I am the LLC, Bradley. I bought the debt. I bypassed the family court entirely and went straight to your desperate creditors. I now own this residential estate 100% free and clear. My name is the only name on the deed." Which means, she continued, dropping her voice to a chillingly calm register, "you are currently trespassing on my private property." The realization hit Bradley hard. His escape plan was locked inside a house that now belonged to the woman he spent years trying to destroy. He had nothing. No money, no leverage, and no future. "You took everything," Bradley roared, the sound tearing from his throat. In a blind fit of pure rage, he lunged forward, charging directly at Diana with his hands outstretched. He never made it past the bottom step. The 2 security guards moved with terrifying speed. The guard on the right intercepted Bradley's charge, driving a heavy shoulder directly into his chest. The second guard swept Bradley's legs out from under him. He crashed onto the damp morning grass with a heavy thud. Before he could struggle, both guards pinned him face down against the earth. Diana calmly walked down the remaining steps. She knelt gracefully, bringing her face close to his ear. "Oh, and because I bought your debt, I am now your primary creditor. You owe me the $300,000 you stole," Diana whispered. The crushing weight of the security guard's knee pressing into Bradley's spine was nothing compared to the suffocating realization of Diana's words. He spat a mouthful of damp grass, thrashing uselessly against the tactical boots, pinning his limbs to the pristine lawn he once owned. Diana stood up smoothly, adjusting her cashmere sleeves without sparing him a second glance. She signaled the guards to release him, turning her back and walking up the mahogany steps of her new residential estate. The heavy front door clicked shut, locking Bradley out of his own life forever. He quickly scrambled to his feet. Humiliated and completely stripped of his final significant asset, Bradley brushed the dirt from his ruined suit and marched toward his rented sedan. He had one last desperate option left. There was a small hidden floor safe in his downtown apartment containing $50,000 in emergency cash. It was barely enough to hire a mediocre defense attorney, but it would keep him off the streets while he figured out how to survive. Bradley sped through the city, running 2 red lights in his frantic rush to reach the upscale high-rise complex. He slammed his car into a visitor spot. He practically sprinted through the vast lobby, completely ignoring the concierge calling his name. He rode the elevator to the 14th floor, his mind racing with frantic mathematical calculations. He burst through the door of his apartment, ready to tear up the floorboards, and instantly froze. The apartment had been entirely ransacked. Designer clothes were strewn across the hardwood floors, expensive liquor bottles lay shattered against the kitchen island, and the custom leather sofa was slashed open. Kneeling in the center of the devastated living room was Cassidy. She held a heavy steel crowbar tightly in her shaking right hand. In her other hand, she clutched a thick stack of $100 bills. The floor safe had been pried open, its steel hinges completely destroyed. Bradley felt a blood vessel throb violently in his temple. Cassidy wore a pair of oversized sunglasses and a trench coat, looking exactly like a desperate fugitive. She was out on federal bail, facing an impending prison sentence for her active participation in his commercial real estate fraud. When she looked up and saw Bradley standing in the doorway, she did not look guilty. She looked absolutely murderous. Bradley lunged forward into the living room. He demanded she hand over the money immediately. He screamed that the cash was his last lifeline, his only remaining chance to fight the federal injunctions. Cassidy stood up, her grip tightening on the crowbar. She spat at his feet, laughing with a hysterical, unhinged edge. She told him he was a pathetic, broke fraud. She had just spent the last 3 hours frantically calling his offshore bankers, only to discover that the billionaire empire he had promised her was a complete mirage. Every account was frozen, every asset seized, and his name was toxic across the entire financial sector. She needed the $50,000 to pay her own criminal defense lawyers, and she had absolutely no intention of sharing a single cent with the man who had dragged her into a severe federal indictment. Bradley charged at her, trying to snatch the cash from her manicured hands. Cassidy swung the crowbar wildly, smashing it into a glass vase on the entryway table. The crash echoed loudly through the hallway. She shoved past him, sprinting out the open door and sprinting down the carpeted corridor. Bradley chased after her, his face purple with rage. They burst through the lobby. Ignoring the shocked shouts of the building staff, they spilled directly into the crowded parking lot of the upscale complex. Cassidy spun around, gripping the money tightly against her chest. Bradley lunged again, but she sidestepped him, causing him to stumble against the hood of a parked Mercedes. A crowd of wealthy residents and valets immediately formed a perimeter, their cell phones already raised to record the spectacle. Cassidy did not care about the audience. She stood her ground, refusing to be silenced by his desperate pleas. She wanted to ensure that every single person present understood his total deception. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. She wanted everyone to know the truth about him. She did not care who listened or what they thought. "You ruined my life. You promised me a mansion, and now I'm going to federal prison because of your forged papers." She pointed a manicured finger directly at his face, calling him a cowardly, manipulative liar who preyed on vulnerable women to stroke his own fragile ego. Bradley frantically looked at the gathering crowd, begging Cassidy to lower her voice and get back inside the building. He tried to grab her arm, hissing that she was making a public spectacle and ruining whatever dignity he had left. Cassidy slapped his hand away, her eyes blazing with absolute vengeance. She turned directly to the onlookers, elevating her voice even louder. She announced that Bradley was not just a white-collar criminal, but a sociopathic monster who despised his own family. She revealed that every time he visited his sick, dying mother in the hospital, he would return to Cassidy's bed and brutally mock Barbara's suffering. She told the crowd that Bradley used to mimic his mother's pathetic sobbing. He never cared about Barbara's health or her transplant. He only cared about rushing her death so he could liquidate her estate. The crowd gasped in disgust. Bradley stood paralyzed, his reputation completely incinerated. He had no defense, no comeback, and no way to spin the truth. Cassidy stepped back, a wicked smile spreading across her face. She pulled out her smartphone. "You think I'm going down alone? I kept every text message, Bradley. Every single text where you plan to hide assets and commit insurance fraud." She hit send, forwarding the entire archive directly to Jamal and Diana. My cell phone chimed simultaneously with Jamal's on the glass coffee table in my office. The notification flashed across the screen displaying a massive encrypted zip file forwarded directly from Cassidy. I opened the archive, watching as hundreds of text messages, audio clips, and scanned offshore bank receipts populated my high-definition monitor. It was the definitive blueprint of Bradley's entire criminal enterprise, narrated entirely in his own arrogant words. Cassidy had just handed us the final nail in his coffin. Jamal scrolled through the files, a grim, satisfied smile forming on his face, as he confirmed the evidence was more than enough to trigger a federal grand jury indictment. But before we could even begin compiling the data for the authorities, another alert completely hijacked my screen. Barbara had just gone live on social media. I tapped the glowing red icon, watching as my former mother-in-law's face filled the digital display. She looked utterly pathetic, sitting in the dimly lit living room of a cheap, run-down motel. She was no longer wearing her designer silk garments or imported pearls. She wore a faded, oversized sweater, her hair uncharacteristically flat, and her eyes artificially darkened with makeup to emphasize her fabricated suffering. She stared directly into the camera lens and began to sob. It was a masterful, highly theatrical performance honed by decades of manipulating high society. She gasped for air, clutching her side, claiming her physical body was actively rejecting her transplanted kidney. She cried out to her wealthy friends and country club associates, wailing that she was a helpless, sick, elderly woman who had been viciously abandoned by her own family. Then she pointed her venom directly at me. She explicitly named me as the architect of her destruction. She told thousands of local viewers that I was a ruthless, cold-blooded monster who had illegally stolen her son's home and forcefully evicted him onto the street. She claimed I had deliberately frozen her bank accounts, effectively cutting off her access to the life-saving anti-rejection medication she desperately needed to survive. She begged the community to see the truth about the wicked woman who had dismantled the prestigious Wilson legacy out of pure, unadulterated jealousy. The video caught fire immediately, spreading like a highly contagious virus through our affluent suburban community. The view count skyrocketed from hundreds to tens of thousands within mere hours. The backlash was instantaneous and brutally suffocating. My phone began vibrating endlessly as the comments section of her broadcast became a ruthless digital lynch mob. Then came the direct messages. Women I had previously considered close friends, people I had hosted at my dining table, began bombarding me with pure vitriol. They accused me of elder abuse, calling me a sociopath, demanding I return Bradley's stolen property and personally pay for Barbara's intensive medical care. The sheer volume of the hatred was paralyzing. I sat in my office chair, reading the relentless barrage of disgust from my own community, feeling a cold, familiar isolation creep up my spine. It was the exact same suffocating gaslighting I had endured for my entire marriage. The family had always possessed an uncanny ability to twist the narrative, painting me as the unstable, malicious aggressor while they played the innocent, misunderstood victims. For a fleeting second, the collective weight of their orchestrated reality made me question my own sanity. I felt the overwhelming urge to hide. I locked my phone screen and took a deep, steadying breath. I was no longer the submissive wife who would quietly absorb their abuse to maintain a facade of peace. I looked across the desk at Jamal. He did not offer empty platitudes or generic sympathy. He slid a fresh legal pad across the mahogany wood. I refused to let Barbara weaponize my community against me. We were not going to issue a polite public statement or a weak cease and desist letter. We were going to obliterate her fabricated narrative with absolute undeniable facts. I instructed Jamal to draft a comprehensive high-stakes public defamation lawsuit against Barbara. We worked through the night compiling every piece of financial documentation, property deed, and forensic audit that proved my legal ownership of the distressed assets. We filed the lawsuit the very next morning at the county courthouse, ensuring the case was immediately accessible on the public docket. However, filing the defamation suit was only the preliminary strike in my coordinated counterattack. Because Barbara had explicitly made her failing health and lack of medication the central focus of her highly publicized smear campaign, her medical status was now legally relevant to the defamation defense. Jamal utilized a targeted subpoena to compel the Regional Transplant Center to release her official medical compliance records directly into the public court filings. We did not need to issue a press release. The local media, already whipped into a frenzied state by Barbara's viral broadcast, descended upon the newly published court documents. The records were stark, clinical, and completely devastating. They proved definitively that Barbara was not lacking anti-rejection medication because of frozen bank accounts or a lack of funds. The hospital administration had deliberately denied her prescription refills because Barbara had failed 3 consecutive mandatory toxicology screenings. The detailed laboratory reports confirmed she had tested positive for massive amounts of alcohol and strictly prohibited narcotic substances. She had blatantly and repeatedly violated the non-negotiable terms of her federal transplant agreement. She was actively destroying the precious organs she had stolen from a stranger. The public opinion shifted with whiplash-inducing speed. The online comments section on her video instantly transformed from sympathetic outrage into a tidal wave of absolute disgust. Her remaining wealthy friends immediately abandoned her, releasing official statements, completely distancing themselves from her illegal actions. She had fully expected to permanently destroy my life by manipulating the masses with her carefully choreographed tears. Instead, Barbara was permanently exposed to the entire world as nothing more than a manipulative, toxic fraud who ultimately orchestrated her own inevitable, spectacular public downfall. The satisfying echo of Barbara's total public ruin had barely faded when my cell phone vibrated sharply against the granite countertop. The digital clock on the screen glowed brightly in the darkened kitchen, displaying 11:45 at night. Jamal's name flashed across the display. Given the absolute triumph we had secured just hours prior, I expected a celebratory call, perhaps a brief discussion on finalizing the remaining civil suits against Bradley's shattered estate. I tapped the screen to answer, fully prepared to exchange a weary but victorious greeting. Jamal did not offer a greeting. His breathing was heavy, uneven, and laced with a cold panic that instantly froze the blood in my veins. He bypassed all pleasantries and demanded I come to his downtown law office immediately. I tried to ask for clarification, asking if Bradley had filed a retaliatory injunction or if the bank had discovered a loophole in the property deed. Jamal cut me off completely. He stated, his voice shaking slightly, that this had absolutely nothing to do with property deeds, bank foreclosures, or offshore accounts. He had spent the last 6 hours meticulously combing through the massive digital archive Cassidy had forwarded to us during her explosive parking lot meltdown. He found something truly monstrous buried deep within the encrypted files. He ordered me to get in my car immediately and lock my doors. The long, tense drive downtown was a blur of empty streets and amber streetlights. The towering glass facade of Jamal's legal building stood completely dark, save for the single illuminated corner office on the 14th floor. I swiped my emergency access card and took the private elevator up, the silence of the empty building amplifying the frantic beating of my heart. When the polished steel doors slid open, I found Jamal pacing aggressively behind his heavy mahogany desk. His tie was loosened, his sleeves were rolled up, and his normally composed, sharp features were completely pale. He looked physically ill. I quickly dropped my keys onto the black leather sofa and demanded to know what was wrong. Jamal did not speak right away. He simply stopped pacing, turned his monitor toward me, and gestured for me to sit in the high-backed chair opposite him. The screen displayed a sprawling, chronologically organized spreadsheet of text messages exchanged between Bradley and his mistress. Jamal had isolated a specific thread of conversation. He pointed a trembling finger directly at the date stamp, hovering above the digital text bubble. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the harsh blue light of the monitor. The date registered immediately in my mind. It was exactly 3 weeks before my scheduled kidney extraction surgery. 3 weeks before I willingly allowed surgeons to slice me open and remove a vital organ to save the life of a woman who secretly despised me. Jamal pressed a key, expanding a series of scanned, high-resolution PDF attachments that Cassidy had saved directly to her cloud drive as collateral against Bradley. The documents bore the official seal of the Regional Transplant Hospital. I recognized the standard pre-operative paperwork instantly, but the secondary forms attached beneath the surgical consent waivers made my breath catch in my throat. Bradley had bypassed my legal counsel entirely. He had utilized his senior executive status and his extensive network of corrupt legal associates to draft and secretly file fraudulent medical proxy documents. He had legally designated himself as my sole medical decision-maker in the event of any surgical complications, intentionally superseding the emergency contacts I had personally established. But the fraudulent proxy was only the mechanism. The real horror lay in the document attached directly beneath it. It was a legally binding Do Not Resuscitate Order, ADNR. It bore my forged signature perfectly replicated, explicitly instructing the surgical team to withhold life-saving measures, defibrillation, or emergency intubation if my own heart stopped during the organ extraction. My hands began to shake violently as I stared at the forged ink. I looked up at Jamal, my vision blurring with a mixture of absolute terror and rising bile. I asked him why Bradley would risk a severe federal forgery charge just to control my medical outcome during a routine procedure. Jamal did not answer. He simply reached for the mouse and scrolled down to the corresponding text message Bradley had sent to Cassidy on that exact same date. The text message was stark brutal and completely stripped of any human empathy. Bradley's words burned themselves into my retinas. He had typed, "If there are complications during the surgery, make sure the doctors don't revive her. Her life insurance policy pays out $2 million if she dies on the operating table. We'll be rich, and Mom gets her kidney." The silence in the office became utterly deafening. The air in the room felt suddenly too thin to breathe. I stared at the monitor, reading the words over and over until the individual letters lost their meaning and blurred into a jagged black line. Every cruel comment, every financial manipulation, every gaslighting argument we had ever engaged in paled in comparison to the monstrous reality displayed on the screen. Bradley had not just been a greedy, unfaithful husband seeking to protect his illicit wealth during a bitter divorce. He had not just been a cowardly son, frantically trying to secure his massive maternal inheritance. He had viewed my body as nothing more than a profitable commodity. He had meticulously calculated the financial yield of my death. He had actively, methodically conspired to let me bleed out on a sterile operating table so he could steal my organ for his mother and pocket $2 million to fund his lavish lifestyle with his mistress. I slowly pushed my chair back, the heavy leather creaking loudly in the utterly silent room. The overwhelming shock was evaporating into a cold, terrifying clarity. This was never just about a toxic, abusive marriage, hidden assets, or aggressive financial fraud. Bradley had literally plotted to brutally murder me. We bypassed the morning sun. Jamal shoved the printed transcripts into a leather briefcase, and we drove directly to the FBI field office in downtown Chicago. The local police department was completely unequipped to ever handle the massive magnitude of this specific crime. Bradley had weaponized the paired kidney exchange, a regulated national registry, to execute his scheme. By crossing state lines with fraudulent medical proxy documents to facilitate a premeditated assassination for a $2 million insurance payout, he successfully escalated his own crimes to federal conspiracy. The federal agents took us seriously. Two seasoned investigators sat across from us in a sterile interrogation room. They reviewed the text message archive matching Bradley's timestamps with the date of my forged "Do Not Resuscitate" order. Their expressions hardened, reading Bradley's explicit instructions to let me bleed out on the operating table. The FBI classified the case as a massive conspiracy to commit murder coupled with health insurance fraud. They took federal jurisdiction immediately, needing an airtight confession to guarantee a conviction that would put Bradley away for life. They needed an inside asset, and Cassidy was the perfect, desperate pawn. She was already facing severe prison time for her willing participation in Bradley's commercial real estate embezzlement. When Agent Miller approached her with a highly restricted plea deal, offering a significantly reduced sentence in exchange for her active cooperation, Cassidy did not hesitate. She agreed to wear a concealed wire and lure Bradley into a carefully orchestrated sting operation. The location was a dilapidated all-night diner on the outskirts of the city, a place Bradley would never frequent under normal circumstances, making him feel secure in its anonymity. 3 days after my revelation in Jamal's office, the trap was set. Federal agents disguised as weary truck drivers and late-shift waitresses seamlessly blended into the diner's greasy environment. I sat 2 blocks away in a darkened surveillance van, sitting beside Jamal and a technical operative. A pair of heavy headphones pressed against my ears, feeding me the live, crackling audio from the microphone taped to Cassidy's chest. Bradley arrived exactly on time, slipping into the vinyl booth across from Cassidy. He sounded exhausted but remarkably arrogant, demanding to know why she had summoned him after their explosive public fight. Cassidy played her part flawlessly. She adopted a trembling, terrified persona, crying about her impending trial and begging him to assure her that their ultimate plan was still viable. Bradley swallowed the bait whole. His voice dripped with the familiar, suffocating condescension he had used on me for a decade. He laughed, a cruel, echoing sound that made my stomach churn. He told Cassidy to stop acting like a hysterical child. He bragged that he had never failed to control a situation because he knew exactly how to manipulate weak women. He confidently detailed his lifelong history of psychological domination. He gloated about how he had systematically isolated his own sister, turning their father against her, so he could solely control the family trust. He mocked his sick mother, laughing about how he had weaponized her desperate need for a kidney to force her to sign over the last of her estate to his dummy corporations. Then Cassidy subtly steered the conversation to the forged documents. She asked him what would happen if the police found the medical proxy. Bradley scoffed, his arrogance completely blinding him to the trap. He explicitly stated that the proxy was untraceable. He proudly detailed exactly how he had utilized a light box to perfectly trace my signature onto the "Do Not Resuscitate" order. He boasted about his brilliant foresight, telling Cassidy that if the surgical team had encountered even a minor complication during my kidney extraction, his forged DNR would have legally forced them to stand back and watch me die. He laughed again, stating clearly into the federal microphone that he prayed I would bleed out on that sterile table so he could collect the $2 million life insurance payout and buy her the mansion he promised. In the surveillance van, Agent Miller gave a sharp nod. The confession was absolute, premeditated, and captured in pristine digital audio. Miller grabbed his radio and issued a single, decisive command to the undercover agents inside the diner. Through my headphones, the casual clinking of silverware suddenly erupted into a symphony of shattering glass and roaring voices. Heavy boots pounded against the linoleum floor. Bradley's arrogant laughter abruptly cut off, replaced by a confused, guttural shout. Multiple agents swarmed the vinyl booth from every direction. "Get your hands on the table," an agent roared, the sound clipping the microphone. Bradley tried to scramble backward, attempting to shove Cassidy into the path of the advancing officers. It was a useless, cowardly gesture. 2 massive federal agents grabbed him by his tailored lapels, yanking him out of the booth with terrifying velocity. They slammed him violently onto the diner's greasy linoleum floor. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs in a sharp gasp. Heavy knees pressed firmly between his shoulder blades, pinning him completely flat as cold steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists. I pulled off the headphones, the audio no longer necessary. I opened the side door of the surveillance van and stepped out into the damp night air. I walked slowly down the sidewalk, the flashing red and blue lights of the arriving squad cars illuminating the damp pavement. I stopped directly in front of the diner's large glass window. Bradley was aggressively struggling against the agents, his cheek mashed painfully against the dirty floor tiles. He craned his neck frantically and desperately looking toward the front window for any possible avenue of immediate escape. His frantic, wide, terrified eyes stared through the dirty glass and locked directly onto mine. I stood on the sidewalk perfectly still, watching the arrogant man who had methodically plotted my brutal murder finally realize that his entire life of deception was now officially and permanently over forever. The flashing lights painted Bradley's terrified face in alternating shades of crimson and harsh blue. I did not smile. I simply turned on my heel and walked toward Jamal's waiting vehicle, leaving my former husband to the federal agents. Less than 48 hours later, Bradley found himself sitting in a windowless interrogation room at the FBI field office, staring at the bleak reality of a 20-year federal prison sentence. The swaggering corporate executive was entirely gone, replaced by a sweating, trembling coward, practically hyperventilating in his standard-issue orange jumpsuit. Agent Miller sat across the cold steel table, laying out the insurmountable mountain of undeniable evidence. The wiretap audio from the diner, the forged medical proxy, the falsified "do not resuscitate" order, and the massive paper trail of commercial real estate fraud all formed an impenetrable cage. Miller offered a tiny sliver of hope, suggesting the United States Attorney might consider a slightly reduced sentence in exchange for complete unmitigated cooperation regarding any active co-conspirators. Bradley leaped at the bait with the desperate speed of a drowning man. He did not hesitate to sacrifice the only person who had unconditionally supported his every toxic whim since childhood. He leaned across the table, his handcuffs clinking loudly against the metal surface, and pointed his finger directly at his mother. Bradley aggressively spun a fabricated narrative, insisting he was merely a helpless pawn in a much larger, sinister game. He claimed the entire forged DNR plot was Barbara's exclusive brainchild. According to his frantic confession, his mother had been the true mastermind, driven by a deep-seated venomous hatred for my lower-class background. He told the federal agents that Barbara was absolutely disgusted that a woman without a prestigious pedigree or a trust fund was legally married to her golden son. She allegedly demanded I be eliminated so Bradley could inherit the massive life insurance payout and elevate his social standing with a more appropriate wealthy partner like Cassidy. Bradley insisted he only went along with the forged medical documents because Barbara relentlessly manipulated him, threatening to write him out of her estate if he refused to secure my healthy kidney for her and simultaneously remove me from their prestigious family tree. He painted himself as a tragic victim of maternal abuse, swearing he never actually wanted me to bleed out on the operating table. He willingly traded his mother's freedom for a chance at a lighter sentence, fully expecting his lifelong enabler to silently absorb the blame, just as she had always absorbed the severe consequences of his failures. Agent Miller did not waste a single minute. The following morning, 2 federal agents arrived at the cheap motel where Barbara was currently hiding from her aggressive debt collectors. They escorted the bewildered, ailing woman directly into the downtown field office. They placed her in an interrogation room adjacent to the exact one where her son had just traded her life for his own. Barbara sat defensively, her chin raised in a pathetic attempt to project high society authority despite her faded sweater and rapidly worsening medical condition. She demanded to see Bradley, immediately insisting this was all a terrible misunderstanding orchestrated by her vindictive former daughter-in-law. Agent Miller did not argue. He simply pressed a button on a digital audio player resting on the table. Bradley's panicked, desperate voice filled the small room. Barbara sat completely paralyzed as she listened to her beloved perfect son, eagerly throwing her to the wolves. She heard him describe her as a manipulative, hateful monster who orchestrated a violent murder plot. She heard him claim she forced him into committing federal crimes. The absolute illusion she had meticulously maintained for 35 years shattered into fine dust. The golden boy she had coddled, protected, and prioritized over everyone else had just enthusiastically handed her a federal conspiracy charge to save his own skin. The color completely drained from Barbara's face. Her trembling hands gripped the edges of the steel table as the audio recording finished playing. The profound silence in the room was heavier than solid concrete. Agent Miller watched her carefully, waiting for the inevitable denial or the frantic attempt to cover for her son. But the betrayal was too deep, too absolute. The toxic loyalty that had bound them together instantly curdled into a furious, unadulterated vengeance. If her son was willing to let her rot in a federal penitentiary, she was going to ensure he never saw a single dime of his hidden wealth. Barbara looked up at Agent Miller, her eyes burning with a sudden, vicious clarity. She asked for a pen and a yellow legal pad. She did not ask for a defense lawyer. She wrote down a specific routing number and the exact name of an offshore bank located in the Cayman Islands. She pushed the paper across the table. She told the agents that Bradley had completely lied about his bankruptcy. He had a hidden safety deposit box secured under a dummy corporation. Inside that box was over $12 million in stolen client funds he had systematically siphoned from his commercial real estate firm over the last decade. She smiled coldly, demanding they seize every single penny immediately. She told them exactly how to access the accounts detailing the intricate web of shell companies Bradley had established using her maiden name. She handed them the keys to his complete financial destruction. She explained that Bradley had bragged about the hidden accounts just last month, gloating that the money would fund a luxurious escape once the divorce finalized. Barbara leaned back in her chair, her breathing shallow but her voice remarkably steady. She stated that if she was going down for conspiracy, she was taking her treacherous son down with her. The golden child had finally crossed the wrong person, and his ultimate downfall would be delivered directly by the very woman who had created him. The trap was now fully sprung. With the offshore accounts seized and the ultimate betrayal between mother and son documented on federal record, the government moved with terrifying speed. We transitioned from the claustrophobic interrogation rooms to the grand imposing architecture of the federal courthouse. The grand jury hearing was convened in a closed, sealed courtroom, shielded from the ravenous local media. The federal prosecutors were not just aiming for a simple conviction. They were meticulously building an impenetrable fortress of evidence designed to permanently lock Bradley away. I sat in the hard wooden gallery bench, watching the methodical dismantling of the man who had tried to murder me. The prosecution called Monica to the stand. Bradley's estranged sister walked down the center aisle, refusing to even glance in his direction. She took the oath, her posture rigid, and her voice echoing clearly across the silent room. Monica did not offer apologies or weak family justifications. She delivered a devastating emotional testimony that officially and publicly disowned her brother. She detailed decades of relentless narcissistic abuse, painting a picture of a man who viewed his family solely as stepping stones or obstacles. She described how he manipulated their elderly relatives into funding his earliest failed business ventures, systematically isolating anyone who dared to question his supreme authority within the family dynamic. She provided the jury with precise dates and amounts, explaining exactly how Bradley had systematically drained their late father's generation-spanning family trust, leaving her and her children with absolutely nothing. She stared directly at the jurors, tears streaming down her face, and stated that her brother was a sociopath devoid of human empathy. Her words stripped away the final veneer of the prestigious Wilson family legacy, exposing the rot underneath. Bradley sat at the defense table, his face flushed with rage, visibly struggling to maintain his composure as his own flesh and blood hammered the nails into his coffin. Desperate to regain control of the narrative, Bradley's high-priced defense attorney launched a vicious, calculated counterattack. Because I was the primary target of the conspiracy, he aimed his crosshairs directly at my credibility. He paced in front of the jury box, utilizing the exact same gaslighting tactics the family had employed against me for a decade. He attempted to paint me as a vindictive, money-hungry ex-wife who had grown accustomed to a lavish lifestyle I had not earned. He explicitly brought up my humble working-class background, comparing it mockingly to the generational wealth of the Wilson estate. He tried to leverage classist bias, suggesting to the jurors that a woman from my background would naturally resort to fabricating digital evidence and manipulating federal agents just to steal an inheritance I was never entitled to. He aggressively argued that the entire text message archive and the forged medical proxy were elaborate digital fabrications I had created to punish a wealthy man for simply wanting a divorce. It was a vile, desperate strategy designed to make the jury doubt the authenticity of the digital trail by questioning my moral character. I sat perfectly still, my expression completely neutral, refusing to give the defense attorney the satisfaction of a visible emotional reaction. I knew his theatrical performance was fundamentally useless against the incoming wave of absolute, undeniable facts. The prosecution did not bother arguing with the defense attorney's classist rhetoric. They simply called Jamal to the stand. Acting as an expert forensic tax and financial witness, Jamal brought a massive stack of bound audit reports and digital tracking logs. He did not speak in emotional pleas or dramatic hypotheticals. He spoke in the cold, hard language of forensic data. Jamal systematically shredded the defense's entire fabricated narrative in less than 20 minutes. He projected the digital metadata onto the courtroom screens, tracing every single stolen dollar from the looted family trust through the Cayman Island shell companies directly into Bradley's personal accounts. He did not stop there. Jamal presented the irrefutable IP address logs connected to the forged medical proxy and the fraudulent do not resuscitate order. He proved beyond a shadow of a legal doubt that the documents had not only been forged, but they had been created, saved, and transmitted directly from the IP address exclusively assigned to Bradley's personal laptop in his private home office. Jamal then tied the fraudulent cancellation of my independent health insurance policy to the exact same device, proving a premeditated timeline of isolation and attempted murder. The defense attorney sank back into his chair, utterly defeated by the impenetrable wall of forensic tracking. The narrative of the vindictive, fabricating ex-wife evaporated instantly, replaced by the stark, terrifying reality of a highly organized federal criminal conspiracy. The grand jury did not require lengthy deliberations. They returned to the courtroom with whiplash speed. The four-persons stood and delivered a sweeping, comprehensive indictment. Bradley was officially facing severe federal charges on 6 distinct counts, including conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, identity theft, and massive interstate financial embezzlement. The sheer weight of the charges carried a mandatory minimum sentence that practically guaranteed Bradley would spend the rest of his natural life behind federal bars. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked around his wrists once again as the U.S. Marshals prepared to transfer him back to federal holding. The criminal aspect of my nightmare was finally secured. However, the battle was not entirely over. While the federal government was preparing to permanently strip Bradley of his freedom, I was preparing to completely strip him of his remaining illicit assets. As Bradley was forcefully led out of the courtroom, his eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for any remaining ally, but finding only cold stares. He was now completely isolated, stripped of his power and prestige. Jamal leaned over the wooden divider and tapped his polished watch with a decisive, calculated motion. The criminal indictment was spectacular, validating every single suspicion I harbored. But the civil trial regarding the financial restitution between Diana and Bradley was scheduled to begin at 9 o'clock the very next morning. 9 o'clock arrived with the sharp strike of the judge's gavel echoing through the sprawling county courthouse. The federal criminal indictment had effectively neutralized Bradley, stripping him of his liberty, but the civil trial was the necessary mechanism to completely dismantle his illicit financial empire. Jamal had filed a comprehensive web of civil litigation, aggressively targeting every single asset Bradley had touched, hidden, or transferred. That explicitly included the hundreds of thousands of dollars he had illegally funneled to his mistress for their escapes. Cassidy's federal plea deal had guaranteed her absolute immunity from a lengthy prison sentence regarding the murder conspiracy, but that conditional immunity did not extend to the stolen marital funds she had eagerly helped embezzle. Jamal's civil suit was designed to hold her financially liable for every penny, a harsh reality that prompted an urgent, desperate message from her appointed attorney requesting a brief personal mediation before the morning recess. I agreed to the meeting. We convened in a small, windowless conference room down the hall from the main civil court. The space was claustrophobic, smelling faintly of floor wax, stale coffee, and nervous sweat. Cassidy sat across the cheap laminate table, her demeanor a jarring contrast to the arrogant, designer-clad woman who had once confidently screamed at me in the hospital parking lot. She wore a faded basic blouse that hung loosely on her frame. Her hair was pulled back into a messy, unkempt knot, and her manicured nails were bitten down to the quick. She looked absolutely exhausted, trembling slightly as I took the rigid wooden seat opposite her. Jamal stood silently by the closed door, a formidable towering sentry observing the final pathetic remnants of Bradley's shattered illusion. Cassidy did not wait for her lawyer to formally open the mediation. She completely bypassed legal protocol, leaning forward and clasping her hands together in a display of manufactured remorse. She begged me to show mercy. Tears spilled over her lower lashes as she sobbed, claiming she had never wanted anyone to get hurt. She cried that she was just a naive pawn, a victim of Bradley's masterful psychological manipulation. She insisted he had completely controlled her mind, promising her a magical fairy tale life while expertly hiding his monstrous intentions. She pleaded with me to drop the aggressive civil lawsuit, weeping that Jamal's proposed wage garnishment would permanently ruin her life and leave her utterly destitute upon the unforgiving streets. I let her finish her theatrical performance. The tears flowing down her pale cheeks were genuine, but they were selfish tears of absolute self-pity, not remorse. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, and looked directly into her panicked, darting eyes. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a cold, surgical precision that made her visibly flinch. I reminded her that she was not a helpless pawn when she eagerly slipped my stolen 3-carat diamond ring onto her finger. I pointed out that she was not under severe psychological duress when she knowingly utilized her official notary license to stamp and validate the fraudulent property transfer documents. She knew exactly what she was signing on those dotted lines. She had actively helped forge the eviction notices designed to render me entirely homeless and financially crippled while I was actively recovering from major organ extraction surgery. She had enthusiastically participated in the complete targeted destruction of my life, fully expecting to reap the lavish rewards of my sudden demise. Her tears abruptly stopped, replaced by a stark, terrified silence, as she realized her victim narrative held absolutely no power in this room. She opened her mouth to offer another weak, fumbling justification, but I cut her off instantly. I told her that she had willingly gambled her entire future on a dangerous sociopath. You wanted his lifestyle. Cassidy? I stated, my voice echoing sharply in the confined space. Now you get his debts. I pushed my chair back and stood up abruptly, signaling the end of the mediation. Jamal opened the heavy door and we walked out, leaving her sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. The civil judge ruled swiftly and mercilessly later that afternoon. Because Cassidy had actively utilized her state-issued credentials to facilitate Bradley's massive real estate fraud, the judge permanently revoked her notary license, effectively destroying any future career in administration or real estate. Furthermore, the court granted Jamal's motion in its entirety. Cassidy was ordered to pay massive financial restitution. A permanent legal judgment was attached to her name, guaranteeing that a significant percentage of any future income she ever earned would be automatically garnished and transferred directly back to my estate until the stolen hundreds of thousands were completely repaid. She was financially ruined, permanently shackled to a massive debt she could never realistically escape. 2 weeks later, I drove through a neighboring town to finalize the sale of one of Bradley's liquidated commercial properties. I stopped at a heavily trafficked fast food drive-through to grab a quick coffee before the final meeting. As I pulled my car up to the payment window, the sliding glass opened. The woman standing at the register did not look up immediately. She was wearing a cheap, oversized polyester uniform shirt, smelling strongly of old frying grease and salted fries. She reached up with bare, unmanicured hands to adjust a flimsy paper uniform visor on her head. When she finally looked up to hand me my printed receipt, our eyes locked. Cassidy froze her face, draining of all color, as she stared at me from behind the greasy, smudged glass. She was no longer the arrogant mistress driving a stolen luxury car or wearing stolen diamonds. Instead, she was permanently trapped in the grim, inescapable reality of the unending minimum wage existence she had ultimately chosen for herself. I did not smile and I did not gloat. I simply took my receipt, rolled up my window, and drove away, leaving her standing there in the exhaust fumes. The exhaust fumes from my vehicle dissipated into the crisp morning air as I merged back onto the highway, putting Cassidy and her fast food visor in my rear-view mirror forever. That fleeting encounter was merely the appetizer for the feast of absolute justice that awaited me downtown. The federal criminal trial had successfully amputated Bradley from society, but today marked the culmination of my grand design. It was the final civil court hearing, the ultimate financial reckoning, where the remaining ashes of his fraudulent empire would be swept up and handed to me. I entered the mahogany-paneled courtroom, flanked by Jamal carrying a leather briefcase that held the meticulous documentation of triumph. The gallery was practically empty, stark contrast to the media circus of the criminal proceedings. This arena was strictly for the quiet, lethal execution of financial ruin. The heavy side door creaked open, and 2 armed bailiffs escorted my former husband into the room. The sight of Bradley in his standard-issue bright orange federal prison jumpsuit sent a profound wave of validation through my chest. The tailored Italian suits and the arrogant, swaggering posture were entirely gone. He looked gaunt and thoroughly defeated by the harsh realities of federal lockup. His wrists and ankles were bound by heavy steel chains that clinked loudly against the polished floorboards with every shuffling step. Despite his undeniable bankruptcy and the looming reality of spending the next 3 decades behind bars, a toxic glimmer of spite still burned in his sunken eyes. He was a cornered animal, desperate to inflict one final bleeding wound before the cage locked permanently. As the Honorable Judge Harrison took his seat and called the civil docket to order, Bradley leaned over to his court-appointed public defender, whispering furiously. Disregarding standard courtroom decorum, Bradley suddenly stood up, his chains rattling noisily, and demanded to address the court directly. The judge, clearly annoyed by the breach of protocol, allowed him exactly 2 minutes. Bradley gripped the edges of the defense table, his knuckles turning white, and launched into a bitter, venomous tirade. He aggressively demanded the court immediately liquidate my private LLC. He claimed that because the corporation had been formally registered during the active years of our legal marriage, it was inherently a shared marital asset. With a twisted, triumphant sneer, he insisted he was legally entitled to 50% of the company's total assets, arguing that those funds should be forcefully liquidated to cover his mounting legal fees and federal restitution penalties. He truly believed he had found a loophole to drag me down into his financial grave. I did not panic. I simply stood up, smoothed the lapels of my tailored blazer, and stepped confidently toward the plaintiff's podium. I looked directly at the judge, allowing a small, serene smile to grace my features. I addressed the court with the precise, calculated delivery of an actuary presenting a flawless mathematical proof. I calmly explained to Your Honor that Bradley's desperate assessment of marital property law was entirely incorrect. I signaled Jamal, who efficiently handed a heavily tabbed certified legal binder to the court bailiff, who then passed it up to the bench. I informed the judge that the LLC in question was not funded by shared marital income, nor was it subsidized by a single penny of Bradley's supposedly massive corporate salary. The LLC was funded entirely by a highly protected confidential medical malpractice payout I had received years before Bradley and I ever exchanged vows. By strict legal definition, those specific settlement funds were an untouchable, strictly separate asset, completely shielded from any marital property division or spousal claims. Bradley's smug expression instantly evaporated, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic, as the judge reviewed the certified bank transfers and nodded in absolute agreement. But I was not finished. The true masterpiece of my retaliation had yet to be fully revealed. I took a deep breath, letting the absolute silence of the courtroom amplify the weight of my next words. I informed the court that the protected LLC was not merely a holding company for my personal wealth. It was an active debt acquisition firm. I looked directly into Bradley's terrified eyes and dropped the ultimate devastating bomb. I announced to the court that my LLC had recently purchased his $300,000 outstanding corporate debt for pennies on the dollar from his defrauded investors. Furthermore, I stated that I was now the sole legal assignee of his mother's $850,000 medical debt collection, which Barbara had vindictively transferred to him before she went to federal prison. I turned back to the judge and officially petitioned the court for full unmitigated wage garnishment. I requested that the judicial order be permanently attached to Bradley's federal inmate account. Whatever pathetic pennies he managed to earn, making license plates, scrubbing cafeteria floors, or doing prison laundry, 100% of those wages were to be legally garnished and wired directly into my personal account. He owed me millions, and I intended to collect every single cent, even if it took the rest of his natural life. He would never be able to afford a single extra commissary snack, a phone call, or a piece of comfortable clothing. Judge Harrison looked down at the irrefutable stack of documentation, signed the final decree with a swift stroke of his pen, and slammed his heavy wooden gavel down onto the sounding block. The crack echoed like a gunshot. The petition was granted fully. The realization of his absolute, inescapable doom finally shattered Bradley's fragile psyche. He collapsed to his knees in the middle of the courtroom, chains dragging him to the floor. He threw his head back and let out a raw, agonizing scream of utter defeat, thrashing against the bailiffs rushing forward to restrain him. As they hauled his violently sobbing, broken form out of the courtroom, I stood victorious. He finally understood he was no longer a master manipulator. He was my financial slave forever. The steel doors of the federal penitentiary slammed shut with a deafening final echo, sealing Bradley inside a concrete tomb for the next 3 decades. The swift transfer to a maximum security facility stripped away the last remaining fragments of his carefully curated identity. The man who had once obsessed over the thread count of his bespoke Italian suits and the polish on his imported leather shoes was forcefully stripped, hosed down, and issued a scratchy, ill-fitting khaki uniform. He was no longer the arrogant corporate executive who commanded boardrooms or the golden child who manipulated family trusts. He was formally reduced to a 9-digit inmate identification number stamped across his chest. His new reality was brutally regimented, dictated entirely by loud sirens and armed guards who did not care about his former prestige. Assigned to the facility's sanitation detail, Bradley spent his waking hours pushing a heavy, soiled mop across miles of bleak, fluorescent-lit cafeteria floors. The agonizing physical labor yielded a meager compensation of exactly 12 cents an hour. Every single month, when those pathetic pennies were tallied in his commissary account, the federal garnishment order activated automatically. The system mercilessly swept the account clean, wiring 100% of his prison wages directly to my LLC. He could not afford a cheap chocolate bar, a stamped envelope, or a simple phone call. He was forced to physically exhaust himself every day, fully aware that every drop of his sweat was actively funding my financial portfolio. His ultimate punishment was not just the cage itself, but the soul-crushing knowledge that his entire existence was now legally bound to serving the woman he had so arrogantly tried to destroy. While Bradley scrubbed federal floors, the glamorous world his mother had ruthlessly protected collapsed into utter ruin. The federal asset forfeiture, combined with the aggressive civil judgments executed by my debt acquisition firm, hit Barbara with the force of a wrecking ball. The offshore accounts were frozen, the family trusts were drained, and her immediate liquid assets were legally seized to satisfy the massive medical debt collection she had vindictively attempted to dump onto her son. Because she no longer possessed the funds to maintain her lavish lifestyle, the eviction process was swift and unceremonious. County sheriffs arrived at her luxury rental property, changing the locks and placing her remaining designer luggage on the sidewalk. She frantically scrolled through her gold smartphone, desperately dialing the numbers of the elite country club women she had lunched with for 30 years. One by one, her calls went directly to voicemail. Her numbers were blocked. In the ruthless, status-driven society, she had worshipped poverty, and federal indictments were an infectious disease, and she was immediately quarantined. The high society matron was completely abandoned by her wealthy peers, left standing alone on the curb with nowhere to go. Stripped of her private medical insurance and her hidden wealth, Barbara became a ward of the state. She was forcefully relocated to a grim, underfunded, low-income nursing facility on the desolate outskirts of the city. The stark contrast to her former life was absolute. There were no private suites, no catered meals, and no dedicated staff catering to her every whim. She was placed in a cramped, dual-occupancy room that smelled eternally of strong industrial bleach and overcooked cabbage. The woman who used to orchestrate elaborate catered dinner parties to flaunt her superiority now spent her endless days sitting in a cracked, sticky vinyl chair facing a blank, peeling wall. She ate bland, lukewarm institutional food from a partitioned plastic tray using a dull plastic spoon. She complained bitterly to the overworked, underpaid orderlies, demanding to speak to a manager, demanding respect, demanding the deference she believed her pedigree owed her. The staff simply ignored her frantic, entitled demands, treating her as just another difficult, complaining resident. She was entirely forgotten, left to wither away in absolute isolation, consumed by the toxic bitterness she had spent a lifetime cultivating. Her grand multi-generational legacy had evaporated into fine dust, leaving her with absolutely nothing but the harsh, unforgiving consequences of her own malice. With the toxic remnants of the Wilson family permanently neutralized, the heavy darkness that clouded my life finally lifted. The financial restitution and legal victories were deeply satisfying, but they were merely the mechanics of survival. True healing required a different kind of closure. A week after the final gavel fell, I drove back to the Massachusetts General Hospital campus. The towering building no longer represented a site of betrayal, forgery, or attempted murder. It represented rebirth. I bypassed the surgical recovery wards, where my former husband had tried to orchestrate my demise. Instead, I walked directly toward the pediatric nephrology wing. The colorful murals and the soft hum of the children's ward stood in stark contrast to the sterile courtrooms I had inhabited for months. I checked in at the main nursing station and was led to a private waiting room. Sitting on a small sofa were a young husband and wife, their faces lined with exhaustion, but radiating profound joy. Between them sat a fragile, bright-eyed 6-year-old girl clutching a stuffed teddy bear. This was the family on the receiving end of the paired kidney exchange. Because I had donated my healthy kidney into the national chain, triggering the cascade of life-saving matches, this little girl received the exact organ she needed to survive a terminal renal disease. As the parents stood up, tears streaming down their faces, they pulled me into a tight embrace. They did not know the horrors I had survived to make that donation happen. They only knew that their daughter was going to live. Looking at the little girl's bright, hopeful smile, the absolute purity of the moment washed over me. I had survived a family built on greed, manipulation, and death, only to help secure life for a family built on genuine, unconditional love. 6 months slipped by with the quiet, steady rhythm of a life finally reclaimed. The lingering dust of the legal battles had completely settled, replaced by the crisp scent of fresh paint and new beginnings. I stood in the center of the expansive kitchen of my home, the very property Bradley had ruthlessly plotted to steal from me. The space was completely unrecognizable. I had systematically scrubbed every single memory of my former husband from the premises. The heavy mahogany cabinets he aggressively insisted upon were gone, replaced by bright quartz countertops and sleek modern fixtures. The oppressive leather furniture he favored had been hauled away to a charity center months ago. The walls were bathed in warm tones, reflecting my personal tastes rather than his rigid corporate aesthetic. I ran my fingertips across the smooth, cool surface of the new kitchen island, feeling a profound sense of ownership. This house was no longer a battleground or a marital asset to be fiercely contested. It was my fortress, completely impenetrable and entirely mine. The aroma of roasting garlic and fresh rosemary filled the air, a stark contrast to the sterile, tense silence that used to suffocate these rooms when Bradley lived here. I adjusted the heat on the stove, pulling a golden roast from the oven. Tonight was not just another dinner. It was a celebration of survival, a testament to the absolute power of cutting out the rot to let something beautiful grow in its place. The sharp, cheerful chime of the doorbell echoed through the hallway, breaking my reverie. I wiped my hands on a white towel and walked toward the foyer, my heels clicking softly against the polished hardwood floors. I pulled open the heavy door and was immediately greeted by a chorus of laughter. Jamal stood on the porch holding a beautifully wrapped bottle of champagne, while Monica stood beside him cradling a sleeping newborn, wrapped in a thick blanket. They stepped into the warm glow of the entryway, filling the house with undeniable energy. Monica pulled me into a tight, warm embrace, careful not to disturb the baby. We had bonded in the crucible of federal courthouses and testimonies, forging a connection thicker and more resilient than mere blood. She had severed ties with the toxic legacy of her mother and brother, choosing instead to build a life founded on honesty and integrity. Jamal clapped me on the shoulder, his booming laugh echoing off the high ceilings. They had become my true chosen family. We moved into the dining room, leaving the shadows of Bradley and Barbara far behind us. The table was set with elegant minimalist china, entirely replacing the ostentatious heavy silver sets Barbara had originally forced upon us as a wedding gift. We sat down together, the newborn sleeping peacefully nearby, and the room was instantly filled with genuine, unburdened joy. There were no calculated manipulation tactics, no passive-aggressive remarks, and absolutely no hidden agendas. We passed dishes of roasted vegetables and seared meats, our conversation flowing effortlessly from the mundane details of daily life to our shared hopes for the future. The oppressive, suffocating shadow of the Wilson family had been entirely eradicated from our shared atmosphere. As the dinner wound down, Jamal stood up, tapping his glass with a silver fork to command our attention. He smiled warmly, raising his champagne flute high into the air. He offered a toast to the most brilliant actuary in the entire city of Chicago. We all raised our glasses in eager agreement. Following the explosive exposure of Bradley's embezzlement scheme, my professional reputation had skyrocketed to unprecedented heights. I was no longer just an anonymous corporate number cruncher. I had formally launched my own private elite consulting firm, specializing exclusively in uncovering complex corporate and medical insurance fraud for high-level clients. The relentless skills I had utilized to dismantle my former husband's criminal enterprise were now highly sought after by national financial institutions and federal oversight committees. My calendar was fully booked for the next 2 years, and my consulting fees reflected my unparalleled expertise. I was completely financially independent, wealthy, and universally respected in a highly competitive industry. I clinked my glass against Monica's, savoring the crisp, expensive champagne. I had taken the very analytical skills Bradley had so frequently mocked and turned them into a lucrative, formidable weapon. I was not just surviving. I was absolutely thriving, dictating the terms of my own reality without answering to anyone. The evening eventually mellowed into a comfortable contentment. Jamal and Monica moved to the living room, whispering over the sleeping baby. I took my half-filled glass of wine and quietly stepped out through the French doors onto the expansive back patio. The crisp, cool night air washed over my face. The sky above was a vast, inky canvas dotted with brilliant, piercing stars. The city lights glowed faintly in the distance, a hum of life continuing on its natural course. I walked to the edge of the stone railing, looking out over the manicured lawn. I slowly reached down, slipping my hand beneath the soft fabric of my blouse. My fingertips gently traced the raised edge of the surgical scar resting on my side. For months, that scar had represented the ultimate betrayal, a physical reminder of a brutal, calculated theft. Now, tracing the healed tissue under the starlight, it meant something different. It was no longer a mark of victimization or a reminder of a man who viewed me as spare parts. It was a badge of survival, a testament to my indestructible power. I had stared into the darkest, most predatory abyss of human greed and emerged victorious. I smiled a genuine expression of absolute peace and took a long, slow sip of the rich red wine. The night was silent, wrapping around me in a warm, protective embrace. The shadows were completely gone, replaced by the brilliant, undeniable light of my own making. The screen fades to black. The core lesson from these dramatic family narratives is that your true worth is never defined by those who mistreat you, even if they are blood relatives. When toxic family members constantly belittle your achievements or exploit your kindness, the most powerful revenge is not malice, but personal independence. True liberation happens when you establish firm boundaries, step away from conditional love, and build your own massive success in silence. You absolutely do not need to seek validation from people committed to misunderstanding you. Share your own experiences with toxic family dynamics and tell us your story down below today.